I think let's get started. Welcome everyone to the AVERT webinar, the Sovereign Citizen Movement, Global and Local Threats. My name is Mario Peuker from Victoria University, and I have the pleasure of chairing the session today. I'm going to take a bit of a backseat position there because we have two brilliant speakers today. Before we start, maybe more important than ever, I would like to acknowledge that we are all on Aboriginal lands. First Nations people have always been and will always be the custodians of these lands. People coming in from all over Australia. We are on the lands of the Kulin Nation, different people from the Kulin Nation. I'm on Bonwurrung land, and I pay my respect to elders, past and present, and emerging leaders. And I also extend this to every First Nations person in Australia, and in particular to those who may be in the audience today. So again, welcome everyone. This is the first time I chair such a big webinar, so welcome. We have over 210 people registered, so this is a big one. Before we get started and before I introduce Kieran and Lydia, just a very quick note on the rules around question and answers for after the presentation. If you have any questions, and we encourage you to ask those questions, please use the Q&A function, so not the chat function. So then we see the questions coming in, and I will have the challenging task at the end to go through and pass them on to the speakers. So use Q&A function. Okay, most of you would know the two speakers today, Lydia Khalil and Kieran Hardy. Dr. Kieran Hardy is an associate professor in the School of Criminology and Criminal Justice at Griffith University and a member of the Griffith Criminology Institute. He's a recognized expert in counterterrorism and national security law. You can read the bio, the details more. I keep it short in the interest of time. And I also quickly introduce Lydia, who I think is going to go first. Lydia Khalil is a senior research fellow at the Alfred Deakin Institute and the project director at the Lowy Institute. Also, as you know, an expert in the field. And I keep it short and pass it on to, I think, Lydia to go first. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mario. If everyone could just bear with me just for one moment while I share my slides so we can get started. I'll just quickly go to slideshow, sorry. Okay, how's that? All good? Excellent. Well, thank you so much again, Mario, for the introduction, and a big thank you to the AVERT Research Network for inviting us to share our recent work on the sovereign citizen movement. For this panel today, for this presentation today, we're going to be briefing on the work that my colleague Professor Kieran Hardy and I did on the growing challenge to the rule of law and national security that this growing sovereign citizen movement is posing for all of us. I'd like to also just start by also acknowledging the generous funding by the AFP as part of the Lowy Institute's new and emerging violent extremism research project. We were able to conduct this work and present this to you today. So what prompted this presentation is this recent work that we've done that Kieran and I have collaborated on, which is a policy brief for the Lowy Institute on the global reach of the sovereign citizen movement. We've been seeing significant growth and worldwide expansion, and also a shift in the threat profile of this movement for many reasons. But essentially, the sovereign citizen movement, I think we should begin by kind of offering some brief overviews about what we're talking about when we're talking about this movement. We've seen, as we said, a significant growth in global expansion, but it's a movement and a pseudo-legal conspiracy theory that's intersecting with broader trends in declines in democracy and satisfaction with democracy. We've seen growing instances of both spontaneous and planned violence from sovereign citizens, which we will argue need to shift our perspective from an ideology and its adherence, this perspective of kind of quirky nuisances, to actually an emerging national security threat. So the sovereign citizens, they don't believe that that they are subject or bound by the same government laws, regulations, or taxes. It's one that I think we should point out and say that it doesn't exist as a single unified entity. Rather, it's more of a loose coalition or an alignment of groups and individuals. It's this decentralized grouping who believe they're not bound by government laws, regulation, and taxes. And it's not an organization as such, but a collection of individuals, some of whom, though, do form groups, but are united in this shared set of beliefs. We won't really get into the minutiae of sovereign citizen beliefs and language and insignia because it actually gets quite convoluted. But essentially, they use these things to get out of obeying laws by using certain language like in phrases such as, I do not consent to this, I am a living man or a living person, I am in the private. And they use these kind of incantations with the belief that, that they, in using them, that they're not bound to follow laws. Essentially, they're a group of people who want to take advantage of citizenship, but are not bound by the obligations of citizenship. And they do this through establishing these pseudo-legal frameworks to justify and argue that existing law is legally baseless. And ironically, they tend to do this within the existing legal systems that they say are illegitimate. In the sovereign citizen movement, though, it's not just these pseudo-legal frameworks. They also intersect with anti-government conspiracy theories that promote this notion that the government is illegitimate and tyrannical, and that therefore that's why it must be opposed. And we're seeing more and more, both actually from its founding, but also increasingly so, that it's been intersecting with other violent extremist ideologies and movements, particularly since the COVID pandemic. And these are particularly movements like the QAnon movement, other far-right manifestations, millennialism, particularly violent Christian millennialism. And as we've said, we've been seeing this growing capacity for violence, and we're seeing this increasing risk to the rule of law, democratic legitimacy, and social cohesion. So just to get briefly into the origins of the sovereign citizen movement, the sovereign citizen movement actually originated in the United States. So it's not one that is indigenous, for lack of a better word, to Australia. It came from the United States. It emerged in the late 1960s and early 70s through the emergence of a movement called the Posse Comitatus, or the Power of Country movement. This was a movement that rejected government authority. It intersected also with anti-Semitic, white supremacist, and other extreme forms of Christian nationalism. And many of its members were survivalists and former armed militias. They also enjoyed considerable support among farmers in rural areas facing bankruptcy and foreclosure in the American Midwest in the 70s and the 80s, which was an issue at the time. There were two movements that kind of grew out of that after the Posse Comitatus movement kind of dissolved. One was a common law movement, and the other was an anti-tax movement. This common law movement was concerned about setting up alternative forms of authority and challenging courts and legal government. And that's kind of what we see is the most common manifestation now of the sovereign citizen movement. The other anti-tax movement was it was involved in that type of quasi-legal activity and more concerned with avoiding their tax obligations and justifying that, similarly through pseudo-law and conspiracies against the state. But these all kind of eventually coalesced and formed into the sovereign citizen movement that we see today in the 1990s. And you'll note that the kind of the peaks of the sovereign citizen movement have corresponded with times of global economic uncertainty as well. They essentially believe the origins of the U.S. sovereign citizen movement. It's believed its basis is this conspiracy theory that the original legitimate U.S. government was replaced by an illegitimate version via the 14th Constitutional Amendment, which was ratified in 1868, which grants citizenship to all U.S.-born individuals. And then since then, there's been a series of fraudulent contracts that have caused U.S. citizens to unknowingly surrender their rights. But it wasn't contained to the United States. It began first spreading to other English-speaking common law countries, first to neighboring Canada around that 70s, 80s time, peaking in the 90s, then to Ireland, the UK, and also Australia. It wasn't until the late 2000s, which coincided with the global financial crisis, that the sovereign citizen idea spread and evolved significantly in other countries. We've got estimates showing that there's a sovereign citizen presence in more than 26 countries, anywhere between 26 to 32 countries, including in Russia, South Africa, the Caribbean even. And we've also had parallel sovereigntist movements that arose independently out of this US version. And particularly here, I'm referring to movements like the ones we see in Germany, like the Reichsbürger movement and others. So these were separate parallel movements, but the core principle was the same, that pseudo law remained central to it, and it was similar across these jurisdictions, and also the belief in these anti-government conspiracy theories around the legitimacy of the rule of law. So again, not to get in too deeply into the pseudo-legal frameworks and beliefs, they established this framework to justify and argue that the law is legally baseless and doesn't apply unless one actively consents, which, spoiler alert, they usually don't when faced with obligations or fines or regulations. Many sovereign citizens now believe, based on that old US conspiracy, that the government is a corporation that controls its citizens, and it controls its citizens through identity and registration documents, which create this bogus legal persona, which they call the strongman. But that doesn't represent your true identity as a flesh and blood person. So therefore, they have the right to divorce themselves from the state's authority by declaring themselves sovereign. So there's a lot of obvious implications to that, to the rule of law and to democratic legitimacy. Now, the COVID pandemic triggered a sharp uptick in sovereign citizen belief around the world, particularly in Australia. There was a concern, say around 2015, of a kind of a smaller, isolated sovereign citizen presence in Australia, but it wasn't really until the pandemic that we saw this big uptick. And that was because during the pandemic, Australia did have a quite heavy-handed approach, much more so than many democracies around the world. And for many Australians, this was the first time in their lives where many people were subject to orders that affected their daily choices and movements. Public health restrictions combined with social isolation and increasing time online, which exposed people to these ideas, created this kind of ideal condition and petri dish for disinformation and conspiracy theories about government control to thrive. And it was during that time that the sovereign citizen movement also overlapped and cross-pollinated with other emerging movements that were also increasing, such as the MAGA nationalists, anti-vaxxers, other anti-government conspiracy movements such as QAnon, and they all tended to align in this common rejection of these collective public health measures and in their advocacy of individual freedom. And so these overlaps obviously contributed to the growth and to the adoption of sovereign citizen ideas globally. And it also led to international coordination of protests that led to a lot of civil unrest that we saw during the pandemic. There was a growth online, as we said. There was a great emergence of online networks and influencers that facilitated the spread of these sovereign citizen pseudo-legal arguments and conspiracies. And the online environment versus earlier iterations allowed sovereign citizens to broadcast their activities, share information and tactics, offer mutual support, and providing them this kind of broader platform for so-called sovereign citizen gurus or leaders or influencers, which we'll talk about a little bit later. Now, not all sovereign citizens are the same, and not all who engage in pseudo-legal practices and ideas share the same profile. And so this is kind of a draft attempt to put forward some sort of typology of sovereign citizen involvement. On one end of the spectrum, you have what's called the naive adherent. So it's an individual who adopts the rhetoric of the movement without necessarily holding deep-seated anti-government beliefs, or they're not the true believers, so to speak. So these are individuals who, typically ordinary people, they're facing some sort of financial or legal trouble. They come across some of these pseudo-legal ideas online. They're persuaded by online gurus to try these tactics, and they try them out in court. So instead of trying to attempt to overthrow the government or prosecute a case that the government is illegitimate and therefore must be opposed, they're basically trying to follow a legal argument that they found online. And they often turn to pseudo law, when they're facing problems like the potential loss of license, or there's rates that they can't pay and they need a quick solution. Then you have more politically motivated. So these are more kind of true believers. They're coming into the sovereign citizen movement or are already aware of sovereign citizen ideology and applying it to oppose or contest a particular issue. We've seen a lot of examples of individuals involved in the sovereign citizen movement who've had a history of political activism in various guises or the other. And, with COVID especially, we saw a lot of convergence around particular political and social issues. So whether that be vaccine mandates, school choice, et cetera. And the people who have been involved in these are, motivated to conduct mass protests, disruptive. Some of it has turned violent. And this is concerning because there's also a two-way flow of ideas of this politically motivated crowd. It's concerning because sovereign citizen influences those motivated by a particular issue. So it helps kind of provide them with a framework for opposing the state. So then it can kind of capture or influence people, say, who are exercised about vaccine mandates or exercised about a particular government policy. At the same time, sovereign citizens are then themselves exposed to other anti-government adherents who are similar travelers. So we've seen how far-right neo-Nazis, for example, have tried to use these mass protests to kind of get in and recruit among broader crowds, right? Because they're sharing this kind of same conspiracy-minded framework, and they share this seeking to delegitimize the state. And so this kind of argues for more extreme and violent behavior driven by these political or ideological motivations. Then you have these sovereigntist groupings or movements. So these people not only reject government authority, they're not only just motivated politically in ideology or true believers, but they actually form groups and play act their own government authority. So some examples of this are the Sovereign People's Assembly of Western Australia. They kind of they wear matching shirts and lanyards to identify themselves as these common law sheriffs or common law guardians of the law. And they swear themselves in, quote unquote, and do basically conduct these kind of mock trials. So for example, they've conducted mock trials to convict the prime minister at the time or sentence premiers, or they've ruled on child protection cases, right? And so they believe that these kind of play active courts and other authorities are the legitimate ones, are superior in authority to over the real courts because they're run by community members, right? And then you can also kind of group micronations along with that. And micronations are essentially people who gain control over a tract of land, and these are often in rural areas where they say, this is my nation, I am sovereign here, my rule applies. And sometimes some people go so far as to putting forward their own currency or their own passports or other identity documents, right? Then you have these influencers or gurus. The Anti-Defamation League basically defines them as people who sell, teach, or promote pseudo-legal theories, showing people how they can bypass government authority and taxes and their legal obligations. Now they operate a lot online, but they also do a lot of in-person seminars. And so they are creating these kind of redemption schemes that people buy into. And then you have folks, on the other end who become radicalized, and whether that's a radicalized individual or a cell. This is the Desi Freeman type of situation, someone with sovereign citizen ideas who becomes fixated and who has violent tendencies. So we're really dealing with a broad spectrum of individuals and involvement. And we're also dealing with a broad spectrum in terms of the growth to national security and government legitimacy. So we're seeing them clogging up courts and harassing magistrates, lots of disruptions toward local councils and officials, threats and violence toward politicians and high office holders have increased. There's a growing capacity for violence there, particularly toward law enforcement. Law enforcement is really facing the brunt of the confrontations with sovereign citizens and are at most at risk from sovereign citizen violence. And then we've seen kind of violent anti-government plots and planning. I think that the broader takeaway here is that while most sovereign citizen adherents are not violent, the narrative that underlies this ideology can justify or result in violence if it's taken to its logical conclusion. So for the impact on the judicial system, I'd recommend works by, say, Professor Harry Hobbs, who've been monitoring sovereign citizens for many years, who has taken a close look at the pseudo-law adherence and the impacts on the courts. But what we've seen is that judges and courts are often the targets of intimidation and threats of violence, and it's actually growing. So, for example, with the Desi Freeman case, there was a lot of footage of him trying to arrest a judge during some of his court proceedings, threaten judges. In South Australia, we've had sovereign citizen litigants and supporters even chasing court officials and bailiffs and judges outside of the courtroom into the town square. There have been reports about break-ins into judicial properties and cars, threats, and essentially, but aside from all of that, it's just kind of the misuse and the clogging up of the court's resources as well. And most concerningly, where it gets kind of quite personal and immediate, is we've been seeing sovereign citizen thinking and ideology brought into child custody cases. So sovereign citizens have been known to set up fake courts to facilitate child kidnapping and child custody cases. We've had cases of this in Australia and the US and France and in other areas as well. You might remember that around the pandemic days, there was actually quite a concerning case where we had this fake AFP coup plot, where we had this video circulating through social media, falsely claiming to be a recording of the then AFP Commissioner Kershaw, detailing plans to overthrow the federal government. And it was the efforts of these kind of this anti-government sovereign citizen adjacent grouping, and it led to an AFP operation where there were many arrests made, and there were the confiscation of fake badges, plans to deputize themselves as alternative federal police. Now, a lot of this stuff does sound fantastical, and there's quite a lot of skepticism about whether they would have been able to pull off anything. But the fact that they're actually doing this is just further delegitimizing authority in the state, which can cause issues. One area I want to focus in on is the impact on local government, because local government is the level of government that is most exposed to sovereign citizen action, because it's the most immediate and accessible to us. And so you've had an uptick in sovereign citizens disrupting meetings and events, harassing and doxing and intimidating local councillors. We've seen them spread disinformation about local initiatives and elections. And similarly, they have overwhelmed local government, just as the courts, with these spurious petitions as well. But we've also seen incidents of violence. So in New Zealand, for example, there was a case where there was a sovereign citizen individual who had been routinely harassing the local council, who actually came in and attacked someone in the council building, and was later arrested for that. It's not just local councils. However, it's all elected officials across the board. And we've seen this again across jurisdictions where they will attempt to arrest, harass, plots to kidnap, plots to harm elected officials, because again, their beliefs are saying that these people are not legitimate holders of authority, and therefore they must be removed. We talked about how the sovereign citizen movement kind of had a great uptick during the COVID pandemic. And this was a good example, I think, about how it can drive violent protest and civil unrest. The Freedom Convoy was a big example of that. It was one of the largest protest movements in Canadian history. And we saw how the sovereign citizens were quite involved in that and were organizers of that movement. Now, obviously, it was much broader than sovereign citizens, but they were key individuals involved in the movement. And we saw how the Canadian Freedom Convoy inspired Freedom Convoy movements elsewhere, particularly in Australia, but also in New Zealand and Sweden and Germany, other places as well, too. I see that I'm kind of coming closer over time. So I'll just very quickly kind of go through cases that you're already very well familiar with around the Porpunka shooting and the Wiambilla attack, about which demonstrate this kind of fixated, radicalized individual or cell, and how sovereign citizen beliefs have kind of motivated that. These type of incidents are unique in a sense because they are not kind of fully planned out attacks, as you would say with the mass casualty event, right? But at the same time, they're not entirely spontaneous acts of violence as well, too. In a sense that, especially in the Wiambilla case, they had gathered firearms, they had booby-trapped their property, but it kind of highlights how the capacity for violence, it highlights how law enforcement is really at the front lines of this threat in terms of them coming across individuals, whether it's welfare checks or traffic stops. And it also highlights this growth of this off-the-grid anti-government sentiment within regional communities, which, while they might not be violent, but can kind of help facilitate an environment for these individuals to operate and hide. And it also highlights risks around rifles and printed firearms as well, even in a country like Australia that has a greater degree of gun control. I'll just kind of quickly, we spoke about the Reichsbürger movement, so I'll just quickly go to the last slide to think about interventions and responses before I hand it over to Kieran. One of the major things is that the major point to mention is that we are at a point where we really need a systematic response. Seeing that this is facing all aspects of government, it's a growing national security threat. Every place where people are interacting with government is being impacted by sovereign citizen or pseudo-legal ideas. And at the moment, we're kind of treating this as an issue that requires individual intervention or an individual response. But what we really need to be taking a look at is the systemic whole of government approach. And the first thing to do, I think, is to grasp the scale of the challenge. It's unclear. We know that it is growing. We have some measurements in terms of data that's collected through the courts and some that law enforcement are collecting in terms of their run-ins with sovereign citizens, but we don't have a lot of data available on the numbers of pseudo-law adherents, and Kieran will talk a little bit more about this in his portion of the presentation. But nevertheless, there is a lot of evidence to suggest that it's growing, but we need to kind of grasp the exact amount a lot more, and that's going to require more data collection, more research, more kind of creative methodologies to reach people who may be sovereign citizen adherents. Another thing that there's more of a movement towards is kind of more civics and legal education. I think this can be impactful in terms of reaching the naive adherents, but it won't reach the true believers or those who are politically motivated. But it can impact those who are kind of incidentally involved or trying to do this to kind of get out of various traffic fines. And it can serve as a good preventative measures. Because so much of these ideas are happening online, our policy paper offers some suggestions in terms of existing online interventions that could be applied to sovereign citizens, whether it's redirection in terms of people who are looking up these types of beliefs, or deplatforming in terms of known individuals who are profiting from being pseudo-legal influencers and gurus. Now, in the CV intervention area, it's tricky because it's not a political ideology as such. Sovereign citizens are not always identified as individuals to be reported to CV interventions, although, in kind of brief discussions with CVE practitioners, they do say that they do get referrals into it, mostly from law enforcement. However, we need to find ways where we can increase referrals where needed to CV intervention programming for sovereign citizens that would meet that threshold. And then the big question is that, well, when do we know when people will turn violent? Because we know that not all sovereign citizens are violent. When will they become radicalized? There are few empirically based research studies into sovereign citizens and radicalizations, and not enough is known at this stage. There was studies showing that there were two different threat assessment tools that were used relatively successfully to distinguish violent sovereign citizens from other extremists through some identifiable patterns, but there needs to be some more testing of violent extremist risk assessment tools against the sovereign citizen cohort. And so I'll leave it at that because I've already gone over time, and I'll hand it over to Kieran to go into the second half of the presentation.
Thanks very much, Lydia, and thank you, Mario, for the earlier introduction. So I'm Kieran Hardy from the Griffith Criminology Institute. And so these are some of the key questions that I want to ask. How many, who are they, and what works? And this really comes from a couple of different studies, but all packaged under an Australian Research Council grant, a discovery project on conspiracy-fueled extremism. I just want to acknowledge that I'm presenting this on behalf of our research team, which is Professor Christina Murphy, Emma Shakespeare, our PhD candidate, Dr. Sabrina Sass, our postdoctoral research fellow, and Professor Adrian Cherney at the University of Queensland. And I'd also like to thank QPS, Queensland Police Service, the Security and Counterterrorism Command. I'll come back to the details of the body-worn camera footage that they've generously given us access to as part of this project. So there's two parts to this I'll talk about. One is a survey of people online, and then the body-worn camera footage study that I'll come back to. So this was a survey fielded in mid-2024 for any Australians 18 and plus. Obviously, we didn't call it the Are You a Sovereign Citizen survey. It's the Australian Trust in Government survey with 200 items relating to things like age, gender, all sorts of demographics, but anti-government sentiment, what we call criminogenic risk factors, but it might be things like abuse in the background and things like that that can explain all different types of crimes. Conspiracy mentality and personality, and self-reported violence and support for violence, all kind of bundled up in there. So we had 1,600 respondents and a decent spread. I'll come back to some of the issues around that. A little bit more male and a little bit more with university degrees than would be a general spread of the population. It's not a representative sample, and we can come back to some of those things to discuss. Now, obviously, I can't give an answer of how many sovereign citizens are there in the community, but I did want to give a sense of what we found from our survey, which gives a bit of an insight into a couple of things. So of those 1,600 responses, we had 427 people basically who agreed with each of these three statements. So if you look at the way they're phrased, the middle one is really the strict sovereign citizen one, like actually self-identifying as a sovereign citizen. The other two are sort of clear statements about the illegitimacy of the law. So if you just look at the statement and what it says, and then the numbers in green, we're actually really quite shocked with how high this was. So we've got just about 30% of people, just under 1 in 3, self-identifying as a sovereign citizen in the survey. And then with the other two, I mean, the first one in particular, the Australian government does not have the right to legal power over its citizens if they do not consent, just getting on 44%. Like, it's not too much further, it would be 1 in 2 people agreeing with that statement. So I think the question, how many sovereign citizens are there in the community? I think there's a question of how many people would self-identify as a sovereign citizen or really align with that specific ideology. But there's a much broader question too of like how many people beyond that kind of more core group don't think that Australian law is legitimate, don't believe that they have to obey it if they don't want to, that they should consent to it, and so on. So whatever the how many question is, there's sort of a concentric circles of kind of core believers, and then I think there is a much wider problem there of people not believing Australian law is legitimate. In terms of the demographic risk factors and things that come out from that survey, so we're looking at the 427 people compared to the remainder of the group, the non-sovereign citizens. None of this is particularly surprising, but sovereign citizens came out as older. They came out as having lower education, lower household income, lean to the right politically, financial problems, past criminal record, and an abusive upbringing. And I've crossed out mental illness because that is significant, but the other way. So you'll notice that it's actually dramatically less than the rest of the sample. I'm happy to talk about that in questions. We've had some debates amongst the team as to whether that means that mental illness isn't kind of an underlying factor that relates to the sovereign citizen ideology or contributes to it in some way. Or it could also mean that it's just not being reported and there are higher instances of it. But at least on the face of the data, it's significantly lower than the remainder of the sample. And then if we package everything up together and ask, okay, so these things are all important, but what's the most important? The two things that really come out are the personality risk factors and attitudinal risk factors, which are more like the ideological beliefs. So trait reactance is basically that idea that somebody doesn't like being told what to do. Everyone knows somebody like that. I'm not doing this, you can't tell me what to do. I'm doing my own thing. You're restricting my freedom, all those sorts of beliefs that go along with it. So that can be measured as a personality trait. And that's much higher amongst sovereign citizens also, and the most important amongst the things that are coming out of this. So it sort of suggests that sort of baseline personality that is less compliant compared to other people. And then in terms of attitudinal, so government illegitimacy, government limits my freedoms, what's the system ever done for me, all that kind of stuff. So it sounds a little bit circular insofar as, well, a sovereign citizen, somebody's more at risk of being a sovereign citizen if they have strong anti-government beliefs or strong legal cynicism, so not believing that the system sort of acts in our best interests and that we should obey it and so on. But it does come out, it goes to debates at the moment, I suppose, around bigger questions around how important is ideology to terrorism. The more we understand about risk factors underlying terrorism, we start moving away from the ideology and say, well, the ideology is the presentation of it or the consequence of these risk factors. But actually, we should be addressing the risk factors to stop people being drawn into the ideology in the first place. The fact that this comes out on top as the most important suggests to me that the ideology still is very important to this. It really is about anti-government grievances. And I think in terms of designing interventions, it's not necessarily one or the other, but thinking about what do we want to target through this intervention? Do we want to target attitudes and beliefs, or do we want to target underlying factors? So you can't change some things in people's past, but there could be supports for other various things, whether that's unemployment, mental health, or anything else, financial support. Okay, so that's the survey, and there's more things we could say about it, but the other major study that we're undertaking is a study of body-worn camera footage, as I mentioned, generously given to us by QPS. So we have our PhD candidate, Emma Shakespeare, looking at this. As a database of 270 odd videos. So just to be clear, they're just random pictures that are representative of what we're looking at. They're not actual stills from the database. But there's 114 unique interactions. So obviously things are filmed from multiple perspectives. And we're asking a range of things, including, well, how do the arguments progress? What signs are there that they're a sovereign citizen when the officers approach them and so on? But the main question that we're asking is, how can officers best de-escalate an encounter when things start going bad? And just to go back before I get to that question of what works, just to go back a little bit to that question of, well, who are they? It becomes very apparent from watching these videos that there is a range of intersecting and underlying disadvantage in these situations. I think in the media and when you talk to people just publicly, there's a lot of sense of these are sort of crazed conspiracy theories. How do they believe in these things? And when you watch, and the videos that tend to be posted on social media or whatever might just be the more extreme arguments or the crazy things they say about the king and the Vatican and whatever. But actually, there's a lot of situations in these videos which overlap a lot with what we see in criminology more generally. You might have DV situations, male partner and female partner being separated, clear substance abuse, alcohol, drugs, unlicensed, unregistered vehicles that they can't pay for, disability, unemployment, and so on. So this comes across really clearly. So I'll just show you a few different quotes from the videos. And I suppose what I'm interested in, with a legal background, I spent a lot of time trying to understand the ideology, going down that sort of rabbit hole and trying to understand what they're arguing and is there an effective way to argue back against it. And I think there's limits to how useful that approach is because they don't necessarily understand the ideology in depth themselves. It comes out a different way every time different people say it. They've practiced these phrases they've heard. But in a lot of cases, I don't think it's ideology dominant. So I'm less interested in what they're saying about the Vatican and the King and whatever, and not consenting to the law and all the other things they say in the interaction. And so it's very clear you get a lot of these quotes. I don't have any money. I'm unable to work because I'm sick. You abuse people. So a lot of anger, a lot of underlying disadvantage, and a lot of anger towards the police service. What's really interesting here, see the words, now that's you personally stop people being able to work. And this is an officer go, and the officer will often say, mate, I've never met you before. This is the first time we've come into contact with you. But there's a lot of underlying anger that becomes quite personal vitriol against an individual officer, even though the individual officer might have had nothing to do with them in the past. So I think that can kind of explain in interactions that sense of they're experiencing some disadvantage. They view the police as being responsible for that, and it actually comes out as a personal attack against an officer, even if the officer is trying to help them in some way. And I think that's quite important to understanding what's going on. See a lot of these police officers acting corruptly. You're profiling us. You've got no basis to stop me. And yes, that comes out in sovereign citizen ideology and words, but there's a lot of kind of common themes amongst this. I have a disability. You single people out. I thought this comment was really interesting. I'm pre-Fitzgerald. So referring to the sort of the early era in Queensland Police, was identify corruption and a major inquiry into it. And this sense of, the police have always been corrupt. I have this long-term anger against police. And this was somebody who at least said they were from Victoria and still going back to that early Queensland era. That's why people hate police. I don't commit criminal offences. You get a lot of claims to victimless crimes like speeding, parking fines, whatever. This doesn't harm anyone. You should be stopping real criminals, not me, all that kind of stuff. You're supposed to be acting in the public interest and you're not. So a lot of that, yes, there's sovereign citizen ideology, but I think that's sort of a gloss over what is like very deeply held kind of resentment against the police force as an institution. Um, and at times they can be more reflective about this. There's one conversation where somebody said, well, you've asked me if there's an emergent reason at all. I've got no money, I need to support my family, so this is why all of this started happening. So then just very quickly as we're getting towards the end, I'll just run through a little bit on what we think works. We're looking at primarily whether procedural justice policing techniques can help to de-escalate an encounter with a sovereign citizen. So procedural justice is really talking about a move away from command and control or coercive policing towards giving people voice, giving them a chance to hear their side of the story. Trustworthiness, so if people view the police as a legitimate, trustworthy institution, then that leads to better outcomes. Neutrality, treating people fairly with respect, and all those sorts of things that go along with that. And there's a lot of evidence that PJ as a field or a technique contributes to sort of better outcomes, whether that's community intelligence or in this case, we're hoping de-escalated encounters as well. Let's give a couple of examples of what this might look like. So you can see here an officer interacting with someone. This was in a watch house cell. Well, would you like to do an interview with us? Well, what would you like to hear? Well, there's two sides to every story. You tell us yours. Yeah, that's what we're here for. And what this doesn't show, so he says, okay, let's talk about it then in the end. What this doesn't show was like multiple videos beforehand of him going on about all the sovereign citizen stuff that we know. And it was only when these two officers came into the watch house and said, well, tell us your side of the story. And they just kind of stopped and went, oh, okay, let's talk about it then. And it dramatically dropped all of that arguing and escalation that had been preceding it. And then this was another great one, that idea of, so there's procedural justice, but we might also think of this in terms of sort of mediation or negotiation techniques, finding common ground. So rapport can be part of PJ as well, but particularly finding something that both people want to get out of that interaction. So this is a fantastic example where a guy on a sort of rural regional road wasn't having a bar of the random breath test. And the officer eventually said, I've got a job to do. My job here, it's not about you have to comply with me to do this. It's about I've got a job to do. I want to make sure everybody is safe on these roads. Let's both get on board with that and you can be on your way. And those sorts of strategies can work really well. So think about what they might want out of the interaction. And so please don't, so I'm not in any way suggesting that these sorts of techniques or these phrases or whatever would necessarily stop someone more determined to do a violent act or commit a violent act against police. We're looking at sort of the more run-of-the-mill situation, RBTs, road traffic stops, house visits, those sorts of things, where we'll get to questions more of violence in the next phase. And so putting this all together, does PJ, procedural justice, result in more compliance and less resistance amongst sovereign citizens and the interactions with police? And yes, and importantly, we're seeing that it's especially strong for all those core pillars of procedural justice, but not as strong where police officers simply explain their decision. So if they just say, we have to arrest you under this, you have to comply, you have to do this, all of that information which is given to the sovereign citizen is still very much rejected. And I think that makes sense in terms of what we know about trying to argue with the conspiracy theorists. They'll double down on their ideology. So police officers may well have to explain something as part of a regulatory requirement, like issuing a caution or whatever. But that's not a way out of the argument. It might be necessary, but it's not the way to resolve an argument or to de-escalate it. And in that sense, those sorts of other examples are really important. And with full credit to our PhD candidate, Emma Shakespeare, she's writing about procedural explanation not being enough, and this idea of interpersonal respect. And so that's not about being nice to sovereign citizens, it's about resolving encounters and de-escalating them. And you saw some of that language before, like there's two sides to every story. It might be we'll have to agree to disagree. It doesn't have to all be you have to stand there listening to them for 30 minutes. It can be quite firm, but according to that kind of language. Agree to disagree. What do we both want to get out of this? All that kind of thing. So I'll finish up there. Thank you, and please reach out with any questions. I'm very happy to answer any questions now as well. Thanks, Mario.
Unmute myself. Thank you, Kieran and Lydia. That was excellent for me anyway, and I'm sure for the people in the audience as well. So I'm now in charge of the Q&A, so I encourage you to put your questions in the Q&A. I have one to kick us off, or a thought, maybe a question. I mean, what became really clear is that the label of that this is an extreme movement or ideology is challenging to apply because of the prevalence. It's a blurry line. So I would find it really interesting to hear your thoughts about what you alluded to before, Kieran. The ideology as a descriptor of once you define yourself as a sovereign citizen, of course, you would then have anti-government sentiments, or as a cause. So is it like a susceptibility factor? Is it something that that can bring people to the movements? Probably would. And in that context, what role does recruitment play? I thought that what Lydia presented, the different types of representation, was really helpful. Some would probably be more interested in recruiting than others, but what role does bringing more to that broader volatile movement, how does that look like? And I think that's a question for both of you. So I leave it up to you who goes first.
Thanks, Mario. Yeah, so just I think it is. So like if you think of something like ISIS ideology, it's easier to think of it in those terms, like you're saying, like an extreme ideology. There's a smaller number of people who might believe in a more extreme idea. I know there's still kind of can be wider, anger against the US or whatever it might be. But at least we sort of know a bit more, well, like this is an extremist cohort. I think it's harder to say that with sovereign citizens, precisely because of that kind of what can be wider distrust in government. And that's why I think the numbers that come out, regardless of what the sort of raw numbers are or how many people say they're a living being, there is that wider problem amongst the population. I think that has flow-on effects for how we deal with the problem. If you treat everyone who might distrust government or not want to comply with a legal obligation as an extremist, and we're dealing with counterterrorism resources and whatever, that would be ineffective and wasteful. So I think that's probably the next question, and the hardest one is who amongst this wider cohort can we consider to be more extreme or more at risk of violence? And that's sort of more where we're heading more with the data. But I like Lydia's typology for that reason, to think, well, yeah, there might be naive adherents that civics education or pre-bunking or whatever might work with. Those strategies won't necessarily work with the more radicalized side. And so about thinking about how you design the interventions across those different parts of that.
I'll just add quickly that, Mario, that I think your question is also intersecting with another question about whether that's been coming up lately, especially after these high-profile incidents with sovereign citizens, that should they be regarded as a terrorist movement by authorities? I think at the moment it would be very difficult to designate, and probably counterproductive to designate them as a movement. I think we also wouldn't be able to designate them as an extremist movement under the recent legislation designating hate groups, because they don't quite fall into that category either. But there are maybe lessons to be learned from other jurisdictions. So they fall within this kind of very tricky space where counterterrorism laws don't quite reach them unless they actually commit and plot a terrorist act. In the United States, because they've dealt with this issue for much longer, law enforcement agencies have developed specific guidance in terms of identifying sovereign citizen behavior, and more training for police in terms of how to approach and handle interactions, and to kind of have more kind of robust case management around interactions with sovereign citizens. They've gone after sovereign citizenship leadership primarily for illegal behavior. They put things like penalties for frivolous judicial filings. In the United States, it's been interesting that they have been designated through various administrations as a domestic extremist organization. Now, that doesn't have a specific legal trigger because there's no domestic terrorism designation in the US, but it does reflect the seriousness of the threat and then the resource allocations that agencies then put to it. In Germany, as you well know, Mario, the way that they approach sovereigntist movements is shaped by the German legal framework, where they can ban movements based on this kind of explicit militant democracy clause in the German constitution, which permits the state to ban organizations actively working to undermine the constitutional order, which we don't have in Australia, but there could be lessons around designations in the future that we can take from that.
Okay, thank you. So now the questions are coming in. So it's I hate to be a gatekeeper there, but I go from the first one and then go through them. So I cluster a few. So the first one is around, it's a rather general question, wanting to ask regarding the two threat assessment tools for sovereign citizens. The second question is about media representation of sovereign citizen, especially how they are presented as sort of the bad guys, especially because of how they clock the legal system. And the question is, does this seems to increase the outgrouping? Should we adopt a more unified approach? I think that's related to Kieran's presentation before. And then there are one more cluster of questions around mental illness. There have been questions. I don't read the whole question, but the role of mental health in the survey and in how it shaped the findings. Maybe there are a few comments you can make about that.
Do you want to go first on risk assessment, Leah?
Sure. I put in the answer an article that actually studied the applicability of the TRAP 18 risk assessment and the HCR 20 risk assessment to sovereign citizens. And you can look at that and kind of get some more information about what that study did from Lee Vargan and Darren Chalakombe. And basically in that study, their findings indicated that there were higher scores on both instruments that were associated with greater odds of sovereign citizen cases being violent. And so that study kind of indicates that some of the existing risk assessments can be utilized effectively towards sovereign citizens. So there haven't been very many studies, but I've just put in the chat one that you can take a look to that will offer you some more detail. And I think, Kieran, you also have a greater awareness of risk assessment applications as well.
Yeah, I think my position is, I think sometimes discussions about risk assessment get caught up in this sort of holy grail of predictive tool. Like, could we arrive at a validated instrument that could predict which of this group is more likely to be violent? And I think more along the lines of, at least at the moment, and probably long term, if risk assessment feeds into, is one other piece of information that can feed into clinical, operational, administrative decisions. Then I think some of these tools in terms of their ability to identify sovereign citizens and higher risk and so on, whether that's for, I mean, we've seen controversy over Vera in continuing detention and so on. So I think that's a really sort of tricky field. I think it'd probably be worth a much longer discussion than I'd be able to give here. But that's absolutely, yeah, something that we're hoping to work towards and contribute to. Mara, did you want me to, I'll move on to the media representation and outgrouping. I think that's absolutely a risk. I mean, you can see in these videos, one thing that will really set off a sovereign citizen is anybody, sometimes I'm not just even talking police officers, bystanders will say, oh, you're one of those people, even, do the hand actions or something like this. And that rightly, like they feel very targeted and ostracized, and that will really set off the interaction and make it much, much worse. So absolutely, I do think that anything that is, that diminishes, that ridicules the ideology just is not a solution at all. And I do think that sometimes public discussion on that. There was even an example recently, Western Australian police came out and kind of said, well, we're targeting sovereign citizens for firearms, and we're sort of, making sure that they're not, and we're saying that they're not fit and proper to hold a weapon because of that ideology. And like, I really do think that anything that they're particularly susceptible to feeling targeted and persecuted. And anything that comes out and says we're targeting sovereign citizens, we're doing a crackdown on sovereign citizens, you're not fit and proper if you hold this ideology. Anything like that, I just think is poking the bear. I'm not saying that means you placate them and don't do anything about it, but I think it's about finding the right language and reasons to do it and avoiding precisely that problem that you've raised in that question.
I just add in terms of media representation, there has been some media representation and reporting that's been incredibly useful, and has kind of shined a light on the nature of the issue and the degree to which we're facing this as a society. And I think that, without it, and I think that's been incredibly useful actually to try to kind of galvanize people and for people in different sectors to make connections. I'll have to tell you, even with this, I've been doing these publications for the Lowy Institute for a long time. Usually when one of them gets published, we get a lot of feedback from people, but I've never had as much feedback as I've had from this report, from people from various sectors, whether it's psych practitioners in the medical field, local government, in the judiciary, education, everywhere, reaching out to say, oh, thank you for putting this. This is what I've seen. And they'll detail all of these things. So I think it's done well to kind of highlight the nature of the problem and to also make people aware that there are others also dealing with this challenge. And hopefully that will kind of bring people together in order to deal with this a bit more systematically. And that being said, there's also been quite sensationalist reporting that I think is counterproductive. But I would kind of point to that counterfact that I think that reporting has helped kind of galvanize more of a research effort, more of a government effort, and kind of a broader awareness of that all these aren't just a couple of cranks that we're dealing with. This is a system-wide challenge that we need to deal with.
Okay, thank you. We are running a bit out of time, so I assume that some people are going to drop out at 12, but we also have we were given a few extra minutes. So I asked one last set of questions, and then we might have to wrap it up. I apologize to anyone whose question I couldn't get to. The last set of questions refers to what you already discussed around intervention. Some are more generic. How could a systemic intervention approach look like? What could it include? Another question was more specific, how we can prepare frontline police, frontline staff to deal with that. What are the potentials there? And the third one around intervention refers specifically to the role of mis and disinformation in the context. Obviously, I assume that would be a central element, and how that could be addressed in intervention measures. And again, apologize for wrapping it up there. I have to make some final closing remarks, but I give you a chance to respond to those questions quickly. Thank you, everyone.
Karen, I'm happy to throw it to you first.
Okay, thanks. So I'll just throw a few. I think I'm answering a few questions at once, but I'd like to deal briefly with the mental health thing. I think what some questioners have raised around a lack of institutional trust in the health system as well may well be very well related to that. I think I'm not speaking for my whole team here, but I sort of look at some of that data around a lack of reported mental health issues. It doesn't mean that there is a lack of mental health issues underlying that. And I think if we are dealing with a predominantly male, older, potentially rural regional population, then it could be a lack of access to services, a lack of trust, a lack of willingness to report, a lack of willingness to seek help, and a lot of things underlying it. So I wouldn't just dismiss it because of the data that's coming out. In terms of misinformation, I think the last time I presented on this, I showed some different slides of law or pseudo-law and had real quotes from the Magna Carta and first-year law textbooks and academic articles, and then stuff from sovereign citizen Facebook pages. And without legal training, it is really difficult. If I showed all my students that and said, pick the real one, I'm not confident they would be able to do it. It takes a lot of nuance to be able to say, well, that is a false legal statement and that is a really accurate one. So I sort of really understand how people could get sucked into that online. Sometimes I think on the whole, I probably think of it less as a crazy conspiracy theory and more legal misinformation in the same way that you might get medical or health misinformation. So I think the way we think about this problem is sort of extremist or not. A problem of extremism or a problem of misinformation could lead to different strategies. And then finally, I'll just address the sort of frontline police question. That's precisely what we're trying to build through these materials, is sort of guidance notes strategies. Here's how to de-escalate an encounter. And I believe the question was from New Zealand Police. So if you'd like to reach out, I'm sure we could continue that discussion and help you in any way we can through what we're doing with QPS. I'll finish up there. Thanks, Lydia and Mario.
Thanks, Kieran. Just to piggyback on your last point as well, too, one of the things that we had advocated for in our policy brief was to do broader information sharing and data sharing, not only among national police jurisdictions, but globally as well, too. So there are already mechanisms in place for data sharing among global law enforcement. Setting up particular task forces around sovereign citizens would we argue would be particularly useful, just like we've done with various types of threat types across the board in various iterations as well, because we are seeing this manifest globally. Different jurisdictions dealing with different cohorts have different approaches. So that broader information, data sharing, lessons learned, what works, what doesn't, particularly in jurisdictions like the United States, law enforcement who've dealt with this issue quite a long time and who've dealt with high levels of gun violence and interactions on that one. But in terms of the question, I think that Malcolm raised around what a broader systemic intervention type would look like. I mean, it is with these thorny problems, essentially trying to do kind of a whole of government, whole of society type of approach. So bringing the various sectors that are being impacted together as a first kind of convening exercise to be like, okay, well, how is this manifesting in your patch? Because as Kieran pointed out, and as the typology points out, we see different manifestations across this issue. It could be an issue of, like the naive adherent, and then kind of like a legal misinformation, versus at the end where, it is real kind of a concerted disinformation campaign, politically motivated, true adherent, radicalized individuals. So it's the broad spectrum. So systematic dealing with this would deal with it systematically across these challenges, across the spectrum of what we're seeing, whether it be disruptions, dealing with it as an individual intervention, how we're dealing with the judiciary, because they all kind of interconnect. I think the Desi Freeman case is quite poignant in that case, because we've seen a trajectory of someone across the years who had shown signs, right, and who had gradually radicalized to violence to the point where he had been at. And so maybe I'll just end it by saying, providing a comment around how to deal with it online and what online interventions around sovereign citizen ideology and disinformation. We saw during the COVID pandemic that a lot of the major platforms scrambled when we saw that this huge infodemic take place alongside of the pandemic, right, to do a lot of targeted work in terms of trying to deplatform particular individuals, to try to rein in COVID misinformation. That had its successes, but it also created a lot of blowback, and particularly in the current environment, which we're seeing with the way that platforms are operating under the Trump administration, where in the United States, where a lot of these major platforms are housed, there's less and less of an appetite for it. But we also know that when there is a concerted effort by the platforms to address a particular challenge or a particular grouping, or when they are labeled under the dangerous organizations principles, that there can be interventions in deplatforming that does take place. I would argue that the most effective deplatforming would be in that influencer guru area, right? So being a bit targeted in terms of where those interventions are, to get at the nodes of the individuals who are actually spreading this, profiting from this, but perhaps prosecuting them through existing legal crimes around fraud, consumer protection laws, things like that, where that intervention can take place, rather than kind of merely deplatforming or ridiculing or further marginalizing the individuals that are kind of getting wrapped up in the ideology.
Great. Thank you both. Thanks for also on behalf of AVERT, of course. So I have a little closing list here, but I keep it brief. So I obviously really great presentations, good questions. This is the beginning or the continuation of a conversation. I'm sure there are lots of questions and conversation we would have in the future about this issue. Appreciate the nuanced and evidence-based presentations from you both. So great. in terms of AVERT, if you are not already doing that, I'm asked to invite you to follow AVERT on LinkedIn and subscribe to the YouTube channel. You can also join the mailing list to find out about future events and webinars. And speaking about future events, also encourage you to join the next two webinars coming up on the 6th of May by Dr. Bettina Rottweiler on nihilistic violent extremism. And at the end of May, 21st of May, by Dr. Kate Fuller from the University of Nevada on the politics of anti-trans narratives. So check out the website and the mail, join the mailing list. That was my promotion piece at the end. Again, thank you, Kieran and Lydia and everyone who helped setting up this webinar and all the audience. I'm going to close this now and wish you a lovely day. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.